In the summer of 1402, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I was preparing to take Constantinople. He had blockaded the city for years, had destroyed a large crusading army at Nicopolis in 1396, and had brought most of Anatolia and much of the Balkans under his control. The Byzantine capital, reduced to little more than the city itself, was running out of options. Then an army arrived from the east. On 28 July 1402, on the plain outside Ankara, that army destroyed the Ottoman field force and took the Sultan prisoner. Constantinople survived for another 51 years. The commander who produced that result had marched from Samarkand. The two men who met at Ankara had a great deal in common, which is part of why the collision was so hard to avoid. Bayezid I had ruled since 1389. He was known by an epithet meaning the thunderbolt, earned by the speed with which he moved armies. He had annexed the independent Turkish principalities of western Anatolia, absorbing their territories into the Ottoman state and driving their ruling families into exile. He had pushed Ottoman power deep into the Balkans. His army combined the Timurid cavalry, the household troops, the Janissary infantry, and contingents from his Christian Balkan vassals, including Serbian heavy cavalry. Timur, who was in his mid-60s by 1402, had spent 3 decades assembling an empire from Transoxiana westward across Iran and into Mesopotamia. His army was built around highly mobile mounted archers operating in coordinated formations, supported by heavy cavalry, and by this stage of his career, war elephants brought back from the Indian campaign of 1398. The dispute between them was over the zone where their expansions met, eastern Anatolia, and the loyalties of the rulers there. The exiled princes of the Anatolian principalities Bayezid had annexed took refuge at Timur's court and pressed for restoration. Meanwhile, Timur's own enemies took refuge with Bayezid, including the ruler of Baghdad and the head of the Karakoyunlu Confederation. Each ruler was sheltering the other's opponents. An exchange of letters between them survives in the chronicle tradition, and the tone escalates from formal courtesy to open contempt. The immediate trigger was territorial. Timur took the city of Sivas in eastern Anatolia in 1400, which was held for the Ottomans, and the garrison was destroyed. Bayezid responded by attacking territory under Timur's protection. In 1402, Timur brought his main army west. The campaign that followed demonstrates why Timur was formidable, and it was decided before the fighting started. Bayezid concentrated his army in the region of Ankara and took up a position with access to water. Timur, instead of advancing directly, moved around him. He marched his army past the Ottoman position, took Ankara, and occupied the ground the Ottomans had been relying on. Accounts describe him diverting or fouling the stream that supplied the Ottoman camp. Bayezid, returning to find the enemy established on his own chosen ground and his water supply compromised, had to fight on terms set entirely by his opponent. His troops had also just completed a long march in high summer and were short of water before the battle began. The battle took place on 28 July 1402 on the Chubuk Plain north of Ankara. Estimates of the numbers involved vary widely between sources, and modern historians treat the medieval figures as unreliable, but the consensus is that Timur's army was the larger, and that both were very substantial by the standards of the age. The decisive factor was defection. The contingents drawn from the Anatolian principalities Bayezid had annexed recognized their former rulers among Timur's forces, and a significant portion changed sides during the engagement. Some Tartar cavalry in Ottoman service also defected. The Ottoman left collapsed. The Serbian cavalry under Stefan Lazarevic fought hard and is described in several accounts as the most effective element of Bayezid's army that day, covering a partial withdrawal. Bayezid held his position with his janissaries and household troops until the surrounding army had disintegrated. He attempted to withdraw at nightfall and was captured, along with one of his sons. What happened to him afterward became one of the most repeated stories of the medieval world, and it is worth separating what the sources establish from what accumulated later. The reliable accounts indicate that Bayezid was held in captivity, treated as a prisoner of high rank, and carried with Timur's army. He died in March 1403, some 8 months after his capture, in Akşehir. The circumstances of his death are not firmly established. Illness is the most commonly cited explanation in the sources, and some accounts suggest he took his own life. Timur permitted his body to be returned for burial at Bursa. The story that he was confined in an iron cage and displayed, and that Timur used him as a footstool, appears in later sources rather than the earliest ones, and historians generally regard it as a legend that grew in the retelling. The image nonetheless entered European culture with enormous force. It became the subject of paintings, and Christopher Marlowe built a substantial portion of his play Tamerlane the Great around it in the 1580s, which fixed the story in the English imagination for centuries. The consequences of the battle were far-reaching and can be stated precisely. The Ottoman state was thrown into a succession crisis. Bayezid's sons fought each other for control of the fragments for 11 years, a period Ottoman historians call the interregnum. It ended only in 1413, when Mehmed I emerged as sole ruler. The Anatolian principalities Bayezid had annexed were restored by Timur and had to be reconquered over the following decades. Constantinople, which had been on the point of falling, was reprieved. The blockade was lifted. The Byzantine Empire survived until 1453, 51 years longer than the situation in 1402 had suggested. The European powers took note. Embassies were exchanged between Timur and several Western rulers, and the Castilian envoy Ruy González de Clavijo, who was present in Anatolia shortly after the battle and traveled on to Samarkand, left the most detailed European account of Timur's court that survives. For Timur, Ankara was not the objective, but an interruption. He wintered in Anatolia, took Smyrna from the Knights Hospitallers, received the submission of the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt and of the Byzantine Emperor's representative, and then turned back east. He had a larger plan, an invasion of Ming China. He set out in late 1404 with a very large army, moving in winter, and died at Otran in February 1405, before crossing the frontier. The battle also illustrates a structural vulnerability in the Ottoman state at that stage of its development. Bayezid had expanded rapidly by absorbing the neighboring Turkish principalities, but the populations and soldiers of those territories had been incorporated within living memory, and their former ruling houses were still alive and available. An army containing large contingents whose loyalty rested on recent compulsion is an army that can be unmade by the arrival of the right claimant. Timur understood this and brought the dispossessed princes with him. Historians of the Ottoman state have identified the reconstruction of Anatolia on a firmer basis, carried out over the following decades, as one of the central tasks of the 15th century sultans. The composition of the two armies is also instructive about the military world of the period. The Ottoman force represented a state in transition from a frontier warrior confederation towards a centralized imperial army, combining provincial cavalry supported by land grants, a permanent paid infantry corps, household troops, and vassal contingents. Timur's army represented the mature form of the Central Asian steppe system, large bodies of horse archers trained to maneuver in coordinated units over great distances, supported by heavy cavalry, siege engineers, and the logistical organization required to keep tens of thousands of horses supplied on campaign 1,000 kilometers from home. At Ankara, the older system defeated the newer one, but the advantage lay less in equipment than in command, reconnaissance, and the control of ground and water before contact was made. One further consequence deserves attention because it reached beyond the immediate region. The reprieve granted to Constantinople in 1402 gave the Byzantine world half a century more of existence, and those decades coincided with sustained contact between Byzantine scholars and Italian humanists. Greek manuscripts and Greek teachers continued to move west during that period, and the transfer of classical texts into Italian libraries was still in progress when the city finally fell in 1453. Historians of the Renaissance have noted that the timing mattered, and the reason those 51 years existed at all traces back to a summer afternoon on a plain in Anatolia. The historiography of the battle has focused on one question in particular. Timur made no attempt to occupy Anatolia permanently. He restored the local dynasties, extracted submission, and withdrew. Whether this reflected a settled policy of establishing tributary buffer states rather than administering distant provinces, or simply a decision to prioritize the China campaign, remains debated. The date itself is worth fixing clearly, because few single days in the 15th century had comparable consequences across such a wide area. On 28 July 1402, outcomes were determined for the Ottoman state, for the Byzantine Empire, for the Anatolian principalities, for the Balkans, and for the relationship between Europe and the powers of the East. What is not debated is the outcome. A single day on a plain in central Anatolia broke the Ottoman advance for a generation, extended the life of the Roman Empire's last remnant by half a century, and demonstrated that the most powerful state in the eastern Mediterranean could be defeated by an army that marched there from Central Asia. History isn't just the past, it's the record of how the present came to be.